Is this on? Yes. Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm gonna let Julie keep catching up. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this event. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that as a land-grant institution, the Department of Architecture and Urban Design at UCLA recognizes our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. It is a pleasure to welcome Julie Eizenberg back to AUD. Julie is an AUD alum from the MARC II class of '81 and a founding partner of the Los Angeles-based Koning Eizenberg. They have an extensive portfolio of projects that include residential work across scales, educational, commercial, cultural, civic, adaptive reuse, interiors, and planning projects, not only engaging with the full spectrum of architectural programs and scales, but also constituencies and the complex context in which architecture takes place beyond the question of site. The types of projects, their scope, clients, and more importantly, the impact of the projects on the built environment has produced a broad and influential body of work. They describe their design process as, and I quote, collaborative and structured to help individuals, organizations, and cities realize their goals, drawing on the active participation of all principals and supported by a diverse and technical team who are invested in humanist values and environmental agendas, end quote. Their work has been published extensively in the US and internationally, including firm and project features in Azure, Architect, Form, Architecture Australia, and Metropolis magazines. They have a firm monograph from 1996 and two publications by Julie titled Urban Hallucinations and Architecture Isn't Just for Special Occasions. The office and the principals have received many awards, including last year's Victorian Medal from the Australian Institute of Architects, Victoria chapter for the University of Melbourne Student Precinct Project that I believe you're going to show tonight. Many AIA California Council Awards, Architizer, the Zine and Forum Fest Awards, the 2022 Los Angeles Conservancy Preservation Award, and almost yearly recognitions from their leadership and contributions in sustainability. Julie teaches and lectures around the world, has served on many boards, including Public Architecture and from Youth Inside Films. She was awarded the AIA LA Chapter Gold Medal in 2012, the Australian Institute of Architects Gold Medal in 2019, and the American Academy of Arts and Letters Architecture Award in 2021. In 2020, Julie was honored as a Design Leader and Architectural Records Woman in Architecture Awards. When looking at successful firms, one always wonders how the personalities, the interests, the knowledge, and the talents of the leadership and each of the team members come together to produce meaningful and successful work. What are the contributions and priorities that each bring to the table? Julie, I quote, brings design vision, leadership, and expertise to the firm's people-oriented design approach. She is an astute observer that leads investigations that reshape the way we think about conventional building typologies. There are a few quotes, unquote, there are a few quotes out there in interviews and publications on the firm's mission statement that seem to connect the person, the firm, and the work. Julie says, architecture is a social medium. It needs to engage, surprise, and inspire as much as it needs to function. She also talks about how to translate seemingly mundane programs into places of ease and generosity, and how the places we craft have the power to welcome, engage, connect, and contribute to the quality of the life of the people that use them. Other central efforts relate to reducing carbon emissions, improve health and wellness, and being vocal advocates for regulatory reform to accelerate needed housing production. Health, well-being, and community are central pillars of Koning Eizenberg's work. When asked what advice she would give those starting their career, Julie said, being an outsider is a creative position, run with it. I think that's good advice for all, whether you're starting your career or in the middle of it. And when asked about the present moment, she talks about optimism, about sometimes having it and sometimes not, and about the challenge of persevering regardless. And those principles and commitment show in the 40 plus years of history and commitment to better the built environment. Please join me in welcoming Julie Eizenberg, our distinguished alumni, back to AUD.
So I was just going to collect slides for this, and then I thought I can't go back there and do what I usually do. So that took me down a rabbit hole, and so I'm going to talk about material issues for us, I guess. What's been preoccupying us since we graduated all that time ago? This is a very slow reacting, here we go. Yes, and I didn't have these 4 words up before because I was afraid people would leave. We're going to start by talking about stucco. I did not expect to come and talk to you about stucco, but as I thought about threads of interest, stucco is clearly one of them. We arrived in LA in '79, fresh off the plane from Australia to go to UCLA. We were overwhelmed by the scale of the city and could not make head or tail of how to engage. We drove around a lot and read Rainer Banham's book on the architecture of 4 ecologies, which was the definitive text on LA for good reason. The plains of Id, described in chapter 3, were home to many of LA's ubiquitous building typologies, including stucco apartments. From outside of LA, back at that time, anything LA, sprawl, freeways, this kind of building, was disparaged outright, and we had been warned by Australian friends not to even come here. Reshape, who photographed and drew the buildings on the screen, like Banham, had a more nuanced relationship with what he observed. Looking at urbanism and buildings not just from a perspective of good or evil made much more sense to us and appealed to our outsider and anti-establishment sensibility. We too were 25. I think this is the time, I'm just reminding people who are students, this is the time for rebellion. This is the time to change the rules. Reshape characterized the buildings as eccentric, embellished versions of modern-style archetypes that express the freedom, diversity, newness, and irony of the visual experience of being in LA. Yeah, that made me see it differently. So if you cut one of those buildings open, or tear it open as it appears in the picture at the top, you find wood studs, part of the reputation that stucco has for being flimsy because it's attached, in our region for sure, on a wood frame. It's wire over building paper stapled to those studs. Used to be wood lathing. Sheathing and insulation are more recent additions. I'm sorry to read this back to you, but it's just so I get through it. 3 coats of cement plaster, scratch, brown and top coat. And between us, stucco does not waterproof anything, which everyone thinks it does. The crack is okay that I showed you at the beginning, but protects the building paper that does. That was an unintended pun, Mohammed, you're laughing. Okay. Although we were very environmentally conscious and took flack for that, like most people back then, we were not linking building materials to climate change. We were thinking about sustainability in the broad sense, not carbon footprint. Truthfully, we took it for granted that a traditional material like stucco was okay, but we didn't really know. So I am making up for that lack of research now because we can no longer ignore the impact of material choices. So here is a synopsis. Don't panic, it's not a treatise on stucco. So let's start with what's in it. Well, that I'll let you read. It's pretty exciting. You got it all? I'm moving on. So what's the environmental scorecard? Because this is pretty important. It's climate appropriate. Now, don't forget, this is all coming from the thing that stucco kind of has a bad rap. I actually think stucco is okay. You know, stucco's our friend. Breathable, high thermal mass, that's good for here. It's got a local manufacturer, supply, and labor. It's easily repaired, resists solar degradation, and even has a fire resistance of 1 hour. It's got low embodied carbon relative to glass, vinyl, and metal, and is a very small percentage of the building's embodied carbon. It's disposable, reusable. We need an environmental product declaration to know that. Is it healthy? We need an environmental product declaration to know that. In other words, we're at a point where we'll be learning more and more about materials, but we still don't know enough. And just if you want to know why we still use it so much, take a look at this chart. Stucco sand finish, and if you're into stucco like I am, there are different levels of finish, and they all cost something different, is $15 to $20 a square foot. If you work with any developer, they are very keen for you to stick to stucco whenever you can. If you look at buildings, you'll often see that there's some fancy material on the front and then there's stucco on the sides. It's this differential between even, let me get to cement board, $37 a square foot and 15 to 20 bucks a square foot. So this would all make huge amount of sense, except that as a percentage of the construction cost, cladding is 8 to 12%. Mechanical electrical systems have been escalating. They're 25% of the construction cost. So we may be worrying about what we use on buildings without really understanding what their proportional impact is. There's a lot of stucco modern style archetypes, as Reshape put it, to be inspired by in LA. Horatio Court, the Dunsmuir Apartments, Dingbat. I put that in because how could you ignore Dingbats in a collection of precedent for stucco? And each of them heightened the expression of plane, plasticity, pattern. These fantastic buildings hanging off the mountainside were by Neutra. I didn't know Beckett was involved in those platform houses, but he was. And then Charles Moore and Frageri come along, and they take generic stucco-clad buildings in new directions. So this is my stucco design scorecard. Plasticity is a great thing to be able to offer. Abstraction is wonderful. The idea of an empty canvas appeals. Cheap is always good. Ubiquitous, cheap, expedient, and anonymous, cheap looking, depends where you're looking and how you're looking. I'm not sure they're all negatives. Which brings me to the beginning of 40 plus years with stucco. As we mentioned, the work that came our way and that we gravitated to was for the most part very budget driven. We did small remodels, houses, affordable housing, and community projects. We ended up building a lot with stucco. So here you get this sort of film strip, it's sort of a bridged overview of design with stucco. Each project was approached in response to place and opportunity, but when collected together, clear themes of exploration are clear. The Macmillan studio was all about thinness. Hollywood Duplex started to talk about volume, and in the 31st Street house, we sort of started to look at how we could shape form. Harold Housing was trying to abstract and get the proportions right, even in an affordable housing project. And at John Adams, you can see solar chimneys give us an excuse to shape a public school building. And by the way, that is Abigail Adams on the building. Every opportunity to equalize the playing field. And that continued with the Ashland Apartments. Now, the Ashland Apartments bother me because they have this stupid cap at the top. So if you're looking for abstraction, that stupid cap bothers you. Now, that's the difference between a lower budget and a higher budget. So when you see the see-through house, you'll see how clean the top of that building is because we had the money to detail that more carefully. But so you've got to work out what you're going to do with these components of the building because each of them is going to undercut or reinforce the idea that you have. So this one, the Sobieski house, is kind of a favorite one to think about with stucco because it applies the principle of thinness as the diagram of the cutout box shows you with the idea of plasticity. And in this case, although it was a budget project, we got to do the detail at the roof so that we could take the roof and connect it to the wall. And then there's a whole group of buildings that started to look at how passive shade, which is something we care about because we worry about the performance of a building, could also create both amenity and shadow and pattern. So what you're looking at is the Arroyo, and these are clip-on metal screens. The Belmar Apartments floor, where we started to combine the plasticity with the planes to get the things. I mean, it matters if you choose a material that has holes in it, as you see in the middle picture. the kind of shadow you get, to one that has a solid panel, and what sort of shade you get from that. And then there's sort of the crazy one, which is I do need that water, which is called the park, and it combines sort of an idea of superplasticity and shaping with light and shadow and pattern. Clearly, that's an upmarket project with an upmarket stucco. So we'll move on to different topics, and the rest of us are done by case study. So another material issue for us is building less. Reuse saves about 50 to 75% of embodied carbon over building new. I guess just for a second, I just want to say what in school you think of as constraints, like it's a cheap building material, or you can only do that much, or you have to worry about a detail or a joint, feels like a restriction on your freedom of thinking. And what happens when you get into the field is that's the stuff you get to actually play and reinvent with. It sounds counterintuitive, but sometimes thinking about how to do things cheaply and how to do things in how they're built gives you more leverage to invent. So it's just a side note. I should stick to script. Let me go back. Anyhow, so we're back in Pittsburgh in 1999. And the Children's Museum of Pittsburgh is in that little post office building. You can see it labeled. And it's pretty grim over there on the other side of the river. And the Allegheny Center at the bottom of the picture is largely vacant. And there's an abandoned mall below that. The Buell Planetarium is shuttered. The Carnegie Library is partially occupied. And the Hazlitt Theater is shuttered. And they had a national competition, which we participated in. And in 2004, we joined the vacant planetarium to the post office and reused, I think we added 50, so probably we reused about 60,000 square feet of space, and redignified buildings that had been neglected, which changes the sensibility for people in a neighborhood about that they're important, that what they have counts. In 2019, the Children's Museum people, and they are crazy. The director of the Children's Museum believes that places for families and children bring back neighborhoods, and she's right. And she is a person who believes that creative arts are the key. This is not a person who hires exhibit designers. This is a person who hires artists to create exhibits. So it's a whole different mentality about the relationship of where the creative arts fit in the interactive museum world. So the Children's Museum of Pittsburgh we did in 2004. They called us back in afterwards to work on the museum lab, which I'll talk to you about in a second. And then Andrea Cochran took all that sort of scraggly land and paved over the place and made a children's park. And now it's the largest cultural campus for kids and families in the country. And she has plans for something new. I'm looking forward to hearing it. And they have 220,000 visitors a year. So let's talk about the museum lab. In 2016, we started on the adaptive reuse of this building. It's an ambitious project for 10 to 14-year-olds, offers 21st century knowledge through access to art, technology, and fabrication rather than books, it includes a charter middle school and event programming space. The library was the first of the Carnegie public libraries, commissioned through an endowment set up by steel magnate and industrialist Andrew Carnegie. It was vacated after it was catastrophically struck by lightning in 2006. It was pretty vacant even before that. It was a serious and formal building with silent reading rooms and precious books stored away from the public in structural stacks. When you're dealing with historic buildings of this vintage, the real key space is where can you put the elevator, because there are so many levels in these old stone buildings. So that's where this project started, is where do you put the elevator? And you can see the sort of blue square. I can reinforce that with a red dot if I do this right. Was here. Then the gathering space, we needed to get the whole thing accessible. So we have the elevator and we have this space, but it's not at the same level as that space, which is a little section, and the front door is another level. Again, I won't go into it. But instead of thinking of accessibility, again, this issue of the things that you think make the design exercise boring actually can give you opportunities to do more than you think. So instead of seeing it as, okay, how do I make a path of travel? You think of it as, wow, if I make an accessible space and I make it big enough, I can actually make it a gathering space as well. So accessibility is a window of opportunity, not an interfering aspect of how you go about doing your job. Now, that doesn't mean you can't complain while you do it. I mean, that's fair. So we didn't add very much, but we added strategically. And the section kind of shows how we filled in there. So although the outside of the building is listed on the National Register, the inside is not too much. Too much was changed. Nevertheless, the hope was that somehow we could reveal some of the interior hidden by the 60s renovation. I mean, they did everything wrong that you could do for a masonry building, because once you encapsulate walls that are stone, the mortar crumbles. That's a hint of what's coming next. This is what it could have looked like. Well, some of what could have still been there. But when we actually started to remove things, this is what we got to. Getting to a stable surface, given the crumbling mortar and sliced capitals, revealed structural underpinnings, load-bearing brick and steel armatures. In truth, we thought it was pretty cool, although we were scared because it was not what we had expected to get. And budget precluded reinstating the original. It was, however, a more fitting backdrop for program that looked at how things are made in a building endowed by a steel magnate, and it provided teens with an edgier and more interesting setting. So we embraced the idea of a beautiful ruin and ran with it. It's not easy getting mechanical systems and electrical conduit in masonry buildings. The Freeland Buck, I think some of you know that firm, they do some great stuff. They did a ceiling installation which evokes the long-gone Tiffany skylight and conceals mechanical equipment and new pipes and conduits, which is kind of the strategy. So if you've got a masonry building, you can't just cut open the wall, stick a conduit in or stick a duct in and patch it up. It's expensive work. It's not like a stucco-clad wood building where it's much easier. So salvage materials were repurposed throughout. The ghost of the fireplace, that's this piece here, was made out of old library stack flooring, for example. There's lots of other stuff. We needed rules of engagement to pull all these varied conditions together. So we called things, we had preservation areas and faux restoration areas. So a preservation area in our mind was revealing all, but repairing distracting gashes. So that's what you would see, what you see on the left, right? There's nothing falling off, it doesn't look dangerous, there's nothing poking out of the wall that can destroy children's eyes, all that kind of stuff. The faux restoration was cleaning it up and painting it. And that was done also to camouflage needed modern interventions like insulation, which was added to the inside face of the exterior walls to improve energy performance. The cut line makes the decision-making explicit. And by the cut line, I mean that line. And where that line went took days of arguments. So I'm sort of walking you through. And you can see, I mean, the free poetry we got, and it's been very well embraced by the community, and COVID slowed it down, but they've come back. So if we go upstairs, you can see where that new gathering space occupies the glass ceiling that was above the Tiffany ceiling that was long gone. The lobby lounge, for some reason, they had put toilets in that area and covered up all the exterior glass. And if you look up, you're looking up from below that I showed you before, where the Freeland Buck ceiling now is, up to what was the glass roof of that space. I have done something wrong. I'm going to go back. Reintroducing daylight was key and clearly seen on what we're doing here through the restoration. So daylight is a big deal. That was what I wanted to tell you. So this is what happens when you clear that out. And talking about reusing stuff, those chairs came out of the city library repository. Nobody wanted those Pantone chairs, so we took them. And as you move into that gathering space, on the left is the entry to the charter school. And to try and keep the connection between daylight coming through, you can see the kids' feet over the glass floor that partially illuminates the floor below. One of the classrooms in the charter school. Heading back out. So here's the issue with places for community. And you have the problem here. There's nothing worse than a stack of chairs stuck in a space, right? Because what it does, it says, you know what, you're an imposition. You as a human, you're an imposition here. What we really need to take care of is the chairs. So we needed a way where the chairs felt like they were second-class citizens and the people were the first-class citizens. So we got some really great hooks from Home Depot with orange rubber edges, and those hooks hang on that wall. And looking back through, and again using light to create edges and I think add optimism. And there's a whole story about how this last piece on the way out of the building got restored, but I'll save you. Which takes us to the issue of building more, particularly in disinvested neighborhoods. We all know the story of Chicago's south and west sides, the racial divide, and decades of disinvestment. The city's Invest Southwest program was initiated to kickstart the creation of housing, community resources, and wealth building for residents in impacted neighborhoods like Woodlawn. To that end, the city established a series of design competitions to develop city-owned vacant lots. Development was framed around the idea of a 15-minute neighborhood, which you've probably all heard about, a strategy that looks to tie density and amenity and transit access to build sustainable and walkable community. In this case, our 15-minute neighborhood was well placed. And the entry I'm going to show you is the winning submission for the site in this neighborhood. But what's interesting is, if you were here last year, Billy was talking about the Obama Center, which is over here. University of Chicago is here, and a bunch of pretty high-powered buildings have been built at the edge of the university. There's green space. This is sort of our core area where there are 6 vacant sites, a CTA station, another station, and you can see there's potential for a lot, but nothing's happened there for a long, long time, except for the gentrification from the north. So these were the 6 city-owned sites. We speak volumes about how forgotten this neighborhood had become from its pre-war heyday as a hub for the Black community. The city was looking for a catalyst proposal on lot 1 or 2. We chose 2, and I can make it change from winter to summer by the push of a button. Voila. And this is what we did. What was great was we were working with developers who encouraged us to challenge the conventions, and we initiated both programmatic and spatial innovations. So let's talk about the program first. This is the first affordable housing development model that actually delivered both for sale and rental housing on a commercial infill development site. Incorporating for sale housing in these deals was on the city wish list as it supports wealth building. The secret was configuring it as a separate building. Sounds silly, but if you're a bank, apparently it's not silly. That simplified the making of the deal, and it also contributed to our being able to think about a typical commercial site differently. Which brings us to form and massing. The approach was new for Chicago. It was a logical extension of what we had been doing in LA. Think the Arroyo and the Park projects that I showed you earlier. It evolved from a mindset of thinking about design and space making as creating mutual benefit for both residents and the neighborhood. It replaces conventional commercial street wall massing with a riff on the residential grain. It offers a soft-scale transition between neighborhood and commercial street, supports the incorporation of for-sale housing, that was our clever trick, brings sunlight through the site to the street on a north-facing lot, which is a huge deal in Chicago, creates public space that enhances desirability for restaurant tenants, gives more green to the street, reduces dependency on continuous active retail to animate commercial streets, and provides a better aspect for apartment townhouses. I feel like a salesman, sorry about that. I extracted stuff from the report we gave them. We were also asked what else could be done to catalyze development on 63rd Street. So you can see we're on the south side of the street, and there was a lot 4 which was a bit smaller. We suggested the city develop parcel 4 with a small park and cultural uses to create more critical mass to attract visitors to the neighborhood after, say, a visit to the Obama Center. It could include a shared parking structure above to serve stores and visitors. If the garage was flat plate, it could change to apartments down the road. This view shows how the for-sale townhouses create a soft transition between residential cross streets and the commercial street. And I know students don't like plans, but us old schoolers love plans, so I'm putting them there for the old schoolers who join me here today. It has a good plan, this building. And some clever devices. I mean, by pulling in the hallway at the end, you get the volume to look thinner, and you get a more elegant proportioning of the pieces. And then finally, the sort of core space around which we hope restaurants will come together. It's still pretty tough down there. The formula isn't quite working. The money available to do these kind of projects and the aspirations for the project don't quite jive. And we're in that stage, we're trying to work out what's really important. And I'll get back to this issue is that, let's say, value engineering is what we call it at the office, or meeting a budget actually makes a project stronger. I'm not exactly sure what's going to change on this one, but something will change. But it will be better. So this is a whole lot of full disclosure that should be cut out of the recording if people are going to listen to this later. Material issues again. The idea of welcome. And this is the last project I'm going to show you. I'm not doing a very long lecture today, but preparing for stucco took me for forever. I don't know if this was a psychological trauma or what, but hey. So working in community buildings and affordable housing, the issue of welcome is a big deal. Social equity and inclusion is cued by making people feel welcome. And there are ways we can do that. So this project, the student precinct and the student pavilion at Melbourne University, is a good example of how to sort of show the sort of thinking that we've been using to approach that issue. So let me sort of back up. I can show you where I lived when I was a student there. It was up here, and we were a great stopping off point for everyone heading home. So this is where you came for a beer at the end of the day. And I will tell you that when we were students here, Hank, who's not here, so he can't be identified by the police in the university, set up a beer machine in what was a Coca-Cola machine, which was found out every so often. No one actually reported him per se, but it kept being emptied, and then we would just kind of refill it. Okay, so here we are, the student precinct, and let me tell you a bit about the University of Melbourne. The University of Melbourne, where I went to school, and there's a fantastic architecture school that Nadir Tehrani did with John Wardle, just a little bit further north of the project I'm going to show you. Has a great research and academic reputation. It has an enrollment of around 52,000 and growing. Students generally live off campus. Many students come from overseas. Living off campus is common for many state and community colleges in California, and very common at universities in Australia. Some colleges are building student housing and services to address the shortage of housing in the US, but that's not what's happening here. At Melbourne, they are leaving housing to the private sector and created instead of an ambitious 225,000 square foot social and study hub on campus. Now, I've got to say they had next to nothing before this, and it's kind of a shame that it took that long. The student precinct is what it's called. The precinct offers art and culture venues. Well, how am I going to get down here? Woo. This has got a different kind of screen than I'm used to. Precinct offers art and culture venues, student study space, recreation, social amenities, and more. Starting from the beginning, this project was run through a national competition. The university had embarked on a meaningful engagement with students before the project started and continued that throughout the process. The students identified diversity, equity, and inclusion, along with sustainability and increased outdoor green space as goals for the precinct. In our case, it brought together firms with varied backgrounds and interests to mirror the diversity of the student body with a variety of architectural expression. Site design was seen as the unifying move and was approached collectively. So let me talk about this team. So we have, and the people we've talked to call it a sort of diversity procurement method. And I kind of like it. So what happens in this method, this isn't the one where you have the executive architect who does all the documents for everybody and sort of has more control than anyone else wants. This is an equitable sort of setup where Lyons bravely went in as executive architect, brought in us because we were the overseas architect, which is kind of amusing. And then there was NMBW, who are an emerging architect, Architects Eat, that focus on hospitality and food, Breathe, who are known for their sustainability work and community housing, co-op housing, and Greenaway, who are a Indigenous firm. So this is the sort of the student precinct. I can push the button and something else will happen. And this is the unifying landscape. Let me sort of, that landscape rolls through the site. It foregrounds the contribution of the Wurundjeri clan, the traditional owners of the land, by making the pre-colonial topography visible. It reflects a general consciousness raising and steps toward reconciliation with Indigenous peoples that is happening in Australia, and becoming increasingly the case here. I'm kind of shocked to hear the traditional owners of the land recognized in your speech, Mariana, because I've never heard that on campus before. Maybe I haven't been on campus for a while. But the issue is important, and normalizing the role of Indigenous peoples in society is really, really something that I appreciate that's happening. In Australia, every event used to start with God Save the Queen, which was a song, and then it went to another song which was equally bad called Advance Australia Fair. Now every event begins with a welcome to country that highlights the cultural significance of the surrounding area to a particular Aboriginal clan or language group who are rightly recognised and honoured as traditional owners of the land. Instead of building everything new, our team chose to keep as much as we could and reuse. And then we decided that what parts of the program would go where. So this is kind of how it played out, and you can see there were 2 new buildings. And partly because we were a long way away, meaning here. So what I didn't tell you about the diversity thing is, so good old Lions were the executive, but the expectation was that as we divided the work up among the firms, each firm would design, document, and be responsible for the construction observation of the building parts that they did. And it was a very collegial effort. In the master planning stuff, the fun part was, it was like studio again. You could talk to other people without sort of an idea that you were treading on toes. We're all looking for the same way of making our buildings better, knowing that we were on safe territory. No one told us what we had to do with our building. We didn't tell others what to do with theirs. We did look for opportunities where we could make intersections that worked stronger. It was fun. So this was sort of how it played out. I think the other reason that we got, so this area, I should have practiced, I admit, I should have practiced before I came. The aerial makes the context clearer. It is exposed on all sides. Our little site is where the pink asterisk building. And it's screened from the street, Swanson Street, where the tram stop is, by a museum, the Maya Asia Center. There's another train stop at the south end of the campus, of the precinct. And so you have students coming from all directions. So this is a building that didn't really have a back or anywhere to put a back. Now, we knew we'd scored with the students when they started calling the building the PAV. You guys think it's a contraction of the word pavilion, but in Australia, a PAV is a very well-known dessert, which is crispy meringue with whipped cream and fruit on top. The Student Pavilion program evolved through our sort of interactive programming as a master planning team, and it came our way as the building for us, I think because it's the least institutional of the precinct programs. We had a reputation for not liking institutional things. It's the informal neighborhood building. It has a food hall at the bottom, a retreat rooftop for events, which feels a little bit like if you had a very rich aunt and she let you have her country house for the day. That's it. A study space and a recreational library where study is not allowed. Earlier this evening, before this opened up to the public, we talked about soft rooms where people went, what's the polite, is it LSD? Can you say LSD nowadays without getting into trouble? Yeah. So where you go to drop some acid, okay? So back in the days, the Road and White Library had all of the music collection, and you could go sit in a chair with your fat headphones on and get them to put on whatever album you liked and whatever enhancements that you took with you, made for a really enjoyable afternoon. So I had a very sentimental attachment to the Road and White Library. So that sandwich of uses is held together with a sort of a structures of expressive columns. There's a lot of rootless concrete work on that campus, and we didn't have a feeling that about good or bad, and this was an opportunity for us to sort of embed some of that history in this new building. And it also talks about this issue. So we talk about welcome. Welcome is about also letting people be in control of the situation. So the idea of discovery is very important for us. So a structural system that revealed itself in one direction differently to another was something that you would discover as you moved around the building. So it's assembled, as you can see, in this sort of sequence. And then what we did is we sort of messed around for a long time trying to work out the proportion of solid panels and glass panels that met the energy requirements and got views in the right places. And this is what some of those columns look like going up in construction. They were prefabricated outside of the university, and the finish that you need to request in the spirit of cheap materials is road grade concrete finish. And this is what the building looks like as you come off the tram. It's a pretty exuberant building, and it again is conveying an idea of welcome by the way you can see people doing things at multiple levels. It's a busy place. What you're also seeing is part of the reason that the university and others are worried about our students, because there's a higher rate of suicide, there's a higher sense of social isolation. So what you're seeing in those screens, and boy, it's a little fuzzy from here, but they actually fold, because you can't have a railing less than 1.5 meters or 5 feet on an above ground level in Australia, because they're worried about people jumping off. This is pretty depressing. So you need to find a way of getting people to be able to have outdoor spaces or indoor spaces that have sectional quality without making it look like you're trying to put them in prison. And it's tricky. Again, another practicality that sort of begets more need for ingenuity. So we made it an active edge. It's one of the few active edges coming into campus. And then we did this ridiculously big, humongous welcoming stair, which meant that everyone could use all of it. Inside, that's the dining commons, and you can see sustainability again played a part in the way the expression of the building is organized. Don't forget the sun's coming from the north, not the south. Remember that, guys. Mixed mode for where we could open up the building for when the weather was good, and conditioned space for where people were going to be sort of studying more and needed more comfortable thermal conditions. Again, for plans, for those who love them. And you can see the way the middle floors connect here, and then there's a sort of a central exit stair here. So the other thing that stair gave us was a bigger footprint inside the building, while making the space between here feel bigger, because we needed 2 exit stairs, and one is that outside stair, and then this is the second one. You can see which steals sort of the minimum of space within the building. So if you go up to that second level, there's a bridge across to arts and culture, which Lions were the design architects for. And, well, you can see what it is. And you go inside, you get this big view of downtown Melbourne, and a variety of places to sit. So when I said to make people feel welcome, you want to make them feel in control, that means you need to provide choice. So we were very big into trying to find opportunities where there were big spaces, smaller spaces, different kinds of conditions where you could hang out. And then upstairs, and again, light, and I should have said it with the last slide, being a really key component of well-being, and which again makes people feel better and feel like they're meant to be there. The other part that I'm not going to sort of dwell on, but we need to talk about, is gender equal toilets and all that kind of stuff, which are taken quite seriously and distributed around the building. And then in this picture, well, you're in the road in white, please do not study. And then you're also in the event space. where when there is an event going on, students appropriate the kitchen space to study, which talks about another thing. So a fireplace is something you sit around and you understand is, oh, that's a social place. I'm meant to go there. A kitchen, for many people, does the same thing. So what you've given is a sort of you've taken a domestic thing and you've created a social role for it to get students to have a place to study that doesn't feel like an institution. And then the outdoor deck from there. Australian plants are slow growing. That is not all dead. PVs on the roof. You get the picture. And then the sort of outdoor spaces are sprinkled around the building, where for small groups to hang out at the edge. And finally, sort of from the south, which is the shady side, where more glass and that view to downtown is, the beginning of the topography of the amphitheater and the landscaping, again, planted very young, because Australian natives do not grow well from transplanted. You have to plant them as babies. And that's it, guys. Thanks. I hope you have questions and enjoyed presenting. Is there a question? Dare someone ask a question? Make a criticism. Come on. Dana.
Thanks so much for showing all this work. I don't know how I got from stucco here.
I'm not sure how you did either.
But, I wonder, just looking at this last building, where you started off with a notion of welcome as an equity and diversity strategy, do you think that's possible in any program or most programs, or do you think it's really tied to the fact that you had a student center? Or could you use those same principles? And one of the things we talked about here is like, how do you break down something like equity into architectural moves? It seems like a theoretical principle or a belief system rather than something that
No, I think it's the physical stuff, and I started exploring it in architecture isn't just for special occasions. One of the issues is informality, which I didn't mention. The other one is, you can make a gesture and do the sort of postmodern thing. This is equivalent to this. But you can also make people feel good and feel in control. So this issue of in control is something that we can provide with the architectural space. That's why informal is better, because if it's a building you can make a mess in, it's not that intimidating to occupy. You don't have to worry if you need to be on your best behavior. So a lot of this is intuitive, but we have used it repeatedly. Where you place something, signatures like the kitchen or the fireplace, hotels do it all the time. They put chairs in a lobby, but you often don't see anybody sitting there. It's basically to signify that you've come to a place where you can sit down, where you are welcome. So these clues we can put into the actual building and furniture arrangements that we make. Now, the people who've done better on the furniture front, who've articulated what all this means a little bit more, is like Clive and all of the stuff in creative office space. Started to look at the idea of how do you make people feel more comfortable? How do you arrange furniture to feel more comfortable? And you'll notice there's a big crossover that's happening between all of these kind of uses, where we're trying to make the people who occupy the building feel more at home and in control of their space. So I think there are physical strategies to be used on lots of building types.
Thanks.
Yes. A victim, yes. I can't hear you. About, hold on, he's coming, he's fast. Yeah.
So, oh my God. Okay. We're doing a.
Oh.
Oh my God. Okay, better. We're having a student that we have to do an art school too. And
A what?
art school.
Art school, yeah.
Yeah. So I was really interested in the on the first educational project that you showed, and maybe that's a very specific question. But we were trying to like question where architecture informs the curriculum of the school and vice versa. And I was wondering, in your project, what force, like if the curriculum forced architecture or your project, your architecture, forced how the school is going to be taught and like the curriculum and
Yeah.
the interactions between students and professors and stuff like that.
I'm a really big believer that strategy is as important as form, and being as non-deterministic as you can without being flexible, because flexible is generic. Actually, I wish Nathan was here because he's one of my partners. He just worked on a high school in Malibu that they're building at the moment, where what they were looking at was a high school or educational project called project-based learning, which has a very specific idea about how you get into disciplinary effort and a different kind of learning strategy. But it's not conventional classrooms. So it's not a hallway with classrooms down the side. So you are being, to a certain extent, deterministic. But one of the exercises we went through was, well, what happens if it is just used as an ordinary classrooms? So what you look for is the case that gives you yes and, right? And that allows for more than one way of things happening. I think I would invoke you've got to make a place, if it's an art school, where you can make a mess. My son went to Brown University, and the art school there is truly beautiful, except it's so precious that it drives me crazy. And it also speaks to this issue that worries me about art museums as they become more corporate and more tidy and more like old department stores. You know, it's all organized for you. And department stores had stuff that was, you know, the clothing at least was messy, but nothing is messy in a museum anymore. I think you've got to create a sense of freedom that you can do stuff, and that you can do by how you look out, where you come in, how you bump into people. I don't think the best environment is one that has a lot of space necessarily. Sometimes it's better that it's too small, just a tiny bit too small, like tight jeans. I don't know, but the deal is that you want to create places of interaction. I'm going on a bit, but it's a great project you've got to do. So yes, all of those kind of things are things to think about, and you'll probably have other things to add to that.
What kind of challenges do you see for designing for the future with autonomous vehicles and new materials, things like that?
Well, it's interesting because I think each generation who gets a whole set of new materials doesn't know that they're new. They just know that they're theirs. So I'm curious to see what people will do. We know that stuff has changed from where we are. What is troubling in the workplace is that there's an acceleration of conventions of doing things one way, and you can't get a lot of customization at any reasonable price in the standard construction market. That I find problematic because there is no room for experimentation. So that I'm more worried about than autonomous cars. They'll get it right eventually. I mean, If people can do it, machines will be able to do it eventually. That doesn't bother me. But I am worried about the delivery system of buildings and what that's doing to the development of ideas. In the back, yeah.
You mentioned that there's I believe you said that there's a discrepancy in communities between finding funding and passion for the communities to
Yeah.
build in areas. Do you have any ideas on solutions for that?
Money? Well, so the problem is all right, this is all done with the best of intentions, so don't get me wrong. The deal is that when you amp up the aspiration of a building to make public space, making that kind of public space adds dollars. An infill building in a street does not have the same responsibility of giving back than one that is that catalyst project I showed you. That had a lot of responsibility. They know it will cost more, but it's hard to get a realistic take on what that is. And then also COVID has thrown out pricing in a way that's difficult to understand, but this needs to be built in. The other piece that needs to be built into that is it's not only that you need to dedicate more money to public, maybe it's a bucket. These are the things you do, you get more money to put those in, right? Is maintenance. Because buildings are still being built, and that's what hit the affordable housing sector without enough allocation of money for maintenance. From a sustainability point of view, it makes no sense whatsoever. From a dignity point of view, it makes no sense whatsoever, but we do not like putting money into maintenance. And I don't think you should be able to build buildings without maintenance being accounted for, and I think they need to get better ways of allocating buckets of money when projects have more than a standard sort of set of features to provide. I think MTA has a number of sites that they're looking at developing. When they become transit-oriented sites, there should be a bucket for what can you do to enhance the give back to the public space. Does that? In other words, I don't have a solution. I'm just here to tell you what the problems are, and I'm really good at it. You lost your question, Mohammed, or you?
No. I was wondering if I should save it for dinner, but Dana, every once in a while, we wonder what the U in AUD is. And urban design.
Oh. Okay.
that you. And it's a story that I've told students every once in a while here, but would love to hear it from you. The old farmers market.
Oh.
And the workaround.
Okay.
In terms of change, transformation, keeping things.
Yeah, so we like the game of keeping things because it sort of pushes you to do something you wouldn't expect to do. That's how, so he's talking about the farmers market, 3rd and Fairfax, where some of you may have done your karaoke, right? If not a Sunday morning breakfast, which is quite beloved by architecture students. But if you asked a bunch of architecture students to design a market and it looked like the farmers market, you would be slashed. Right? Slashed, battered, sent to the back of the room. So there's some disconnect between the improvised vernacular world and the architecture world, which has been a place that I've always had trouble with. So that's where the reshape stuff comes in. You need another framework to look at things that you think are constraints, again, I'll say it again, as actually opportunities to look at things differently. The farmers market, we ended up having to fake old things and add new things. And again, similar game to what happened in the museum lab, to just make up a set of rules so that we could work out how to keep a sense of authenticity to place. And urban design is difficult because it's usually done at a scale where the move is at 1 to 200. And so you don't get any variety of scale built into it. And I'm not a sentimental person. I'm not looking for new urbanism. If it's done well, I'll take it. But I would love it if we could take urban strategies further and experiment more. But it's very difficult. There are very fixed ideas about what the market wants. And it's an ongoing pursuit, put it that way.
I remember, it's been a while, the story of how landmarking was resisted.
Oh, you mean that story? Yeah. Okay, landmark. So at the farmers market, we worked with a really great land use attorney. The city wanted to designate the farmers market, which they should have, because it was a historic landmark, cultural landmark. The market were terrified because they had, 100 and something stalls, and if it went to a historic designation, anytime somebody wanted to do something to their little tenant business, it was going to be a nightmare. So what happened was the land use attorney, and I'm going on the record publicly, this is an attorney I'm talking about, was the most creative person in the room. He came up with the idea of designating the open space rather than the built space. And the minute you did that, you took away the problem in terms of the tenants, and you still preserved the character of the place. It's genius.
I'll ask one question about stucco, maybe to end where you began. I was thinking that a lot of the themes that you're highlighting across projects are of universal character.
Yeah.
Things like environmental concerns or social justice or the question of the public and the commons. But you also foregrounded stucco for us. That seems to be, while you can find stucco in many places, I think it's most characteristic in LA compared to other US cities. And so I thought it was very interesting, that sort of tension that sometimes occur in projects between the principles that are universal, or the things that can be associated with universal principles, and the things that are very local. And, the way you describe stucco, you made a very compelling argument. So could it be made universal, or even that idea of like the universal principle, or that's where, an extensive body of your work, while you have projects everywhere, is in LA? Do you see that as something for everywhere?
So there are people who pursue architecture by materiality. We pursue form and placemaking first, and then the material comes. It was only so this came about, you guys know the LA Forum? So they asked us to team up with Taya Tio, who do fantastic work in Mexico City, Jose and Carlos. And Carlos, so we're doing a conversation. They pair you, which is fun. And they were talking about what they were experimenting with. And they were experimenting with reuse of materials. And everything they made was beautiful. And I was like, oh shit, what are we going to talk about? So then I said, well, what have I been using over and over and over? Again, what's been my experiment, or our experiment? And stucco came to mind. So that's what started the sort of the rabbit hole of stucco and having a look at it. So I wish I'd known what I know about stucco then that I know about stucco now. But we're not that deliberate in terms of material, and the people who are use it differently again. I think that story for me about stucco was to keep up with my colleagues in Mexico City, and then also just to say that a cheap material doesn't mean it's a bad material. And a cheap material, it's like, I don't know, it's easy to have a big budget and do stuff, although I don't think it is, maybe because I've seen some really bad expensive houses, so I take that back. But I think it's kind of more fun and more challenging when the budgets are tight and you're trying to work your way around them, and that you use sort of budget as an editing tool. It sounds really weird, but do I really want this? Do I need 6 ideas? Or could 2, maybe 1 could work? And then everything then hangs on that. So it's sort of a disciplining compositional strategy. So maybe it's budget that drives me more than material. And now I'll never get a job with any budget ever again. But...
All right, Judy.
Thank you.
So much.